more critical transition. And so why do you start at 200 and not a little earlier? Because I can see, okay, maybe you can say Alexander, that's a cut. And have you thought about a narrative that would maybe challenge or really modify this sort of Western-driven narrative? I'm talking about global history because that's where in some ways you're going there.
Yeah,
but you're taking one piece. You're focusing on one piece of the narrative.
That's
and so that sort of
interesting
bothered me.
I mean, I dabble in world history. In fact, you were just mentioning, this is like hands-on. I was just asked by Cambridge to write for this Cambridge World History a narrative of this Near East, which is farther. They actually are interested from 1200 BC to 900 CE.
It's good.
This is sort of how the world historians, I guess, are now approaching this, which is even farther than anything I would know. I'm even stuck in this, my knowledge. But it all depends how we look at it. I think, in my last talk, you weren't, I don't think you were here.
No, I wasn't, that's why.
Okay.
I realized that
I just
you
made an
probably
example of, in my last talk, I was mentioning these dynasties that are somewhat post-Sasanian.
Yeah.
I used the last one on the handout, page 3, the Qarakhanids,
Yeah,
who are in Kashgar.
yeah.
And, Western China, what they do is under Turkic and the Turkic nobles, the way they want to say who they are and to make a connection, they're the single ones actually in this, that they don't connect to anything sort of this Iran Shah or Iranian tradition, but rather say they're Turks, but to show that they're important Turks, they connect themselves to Afrosil, the important character in the Persian Book of Kings and the Shahnameh. That is, even if you want to be the other, between this Oxus or you want to say Syria you still have to play within that scenario of what is going on in this epic history that's been begun with the Sasanians, put into order, and Salmanis as this other hinge, making it current. And I think, so it's that preview, and that's why I think there's a logical cultural unit or work from the beginning of the Sasanians, say 224, you can be, not so exact, to about 1200 or so.
Because what you're saying is that it's, before that you have Iranian influence, Iranian Empire, but you don't see that kind of cultural, because I would say
it's very hard to gauge. I don't know how much of it is continuity, how much is not. But I think with the Sasanians there are some changes that does take place, let alone how much we know about the Parthians.
The Parthians is what I was thinking of.
Yeah, and that is not my purview. Professor Shaigan could, comment on that. But for me, with the Sasanians, there seems to be some changes. And what they do, it continues. It's not a dynastic affair for me anymore. It's more of a cultural affair, and it's much more of a wider expanse of a cultural impact. And that's why I don't want to call it Iranian or Iran, but the idea of Iran Shah, which was a bit different from this, what we use as a nation state. I want to make that distinction. Everything that
because I think I'm not having problem with the project. It just seems that one of the problems is there's a big gap. You have the Greeks and the Perso-Greek wars, and then you've got Alexander, and then the middle, and that whole area disappears.
And Seleucids.
Right, and when I teach world history, I invent narratives, sort of fake narratives to kind of fill it in, because I have a vested interest, in this, in making visible what's not visible. But so I'm really interested. I'm obviously not yet, but that would be really helpful.
But I would like to get your idea about Seleucids, so your work on the Seleucids.
If I could follow up on this critical cut in history, I was wondering indeed what place the Parthians would have, because the critical watershed would be when the Middle East becomes split into two areas, which I think interesting was what your ideas were. Which is the basis for the creation of this Iran Shah, this huge cultural area, which did exist, which existed very long. But before that, you had the idea in which the Middle East was a whole, which Central Asia was connected to the Mediterranean. An idea what was very much alive under the Achaemenids and under the Seleucids, I would argue. So somewhere, and Rome has to do with that, of course, a frontier is created which runs through the Middle East, and this old idea. Well, ideologically, the idea, of course, of unity was never given up on the great king, but in practice, you get this smaller, relatively smaller area, which becomes the Iranian world, because the Western Middle East falls off. It was really a question. Do you have any ideas about that? The area must come into existence somewhere after the demise of the Seleucids.
Can I pass it to Dr.
The idea is
Schrager?
actually there before even. This has nothing to. The idea is certainly there. It's like even it's at the concept of Dahyush Aryana, which is very much a concept, and that they go up to the Mediterranean from Indus to the Mediterranean. There is no split empire. There is no division, there is no Seleucid moribund state that that Rome has taken over, and then the Euphrates or Tigris dividing Parthia and the Seleucid Empire. So, but they have the concept of Dahyush Aryana. There is a concept, it might be different obviously than the Iran Shah, but they are a world empire. They go from Indus to the Mediterranean, but they have nonetheless a concept of Dahyush Aryana, which is the country of the Iranians, or of the basically what Iran Shah is, the empire of the Iranians.
Yes, but that's inclusive of Western.
No, it's not.
Okay.
No. It's the empire. We don't know where it is, but it's where the Iranians live. So, and obviously the Iranians might be living in Sardis, and in that time it might be inclusive of it. But we don't know if it is really the so-called, the fundamental places where Iranians have been settled from time immemorial, or is it wherever Iranians have been settled by dint of the Achaemenid administration's volition. But they have a concept which does not match always the reality of the empire. So I think the concept of Iran Shah, which he's referring to, or Dahyush Aryana, is being recreated time and again with different realities, geographic, topographic realities. But it is primarily an ideal more than anything else.
My question would then be based on that ideal, and speaking of a culture block, how does that relate to the advantage of integrating the notion of late antiquity into the historiography, especially if in terms of what I work on, or things I don't work on, but say processes of Hellenization that are continuous throughout late antiquity that suggest that despite the frontier as a political military border, you essentially have flows of humans and traditions across the Fertile Crescent in such a way that would suggest, whether it's Syriac Christianity or rabbinic traditions or whatever, that there are meaningful connections that would not. But I presume when the Sasanian world is integrating late antiquity, that's what it's being gestured at. That kind of those filaments of connection between the Iranian world and the Mediterranean world. So how do you put these two?
For me, the Sasanian world is not Zoroastrian. The Sasanian world is, it has actually these communal religions are all part of that. I mean, the Jewish, the Zoroastrian. It depends, of course, when you're looking at it from Judaic studies or Jewish studies, it's a bit different. But I think Sasanian studies would be much more inclusive of, people who do Syriac, like Joe Walker, those who do Jewish studies, Talmudic studies, those who are doing, other studies. All of this does work within this rubric, also becomes part of the Sasanian studies. But for me, late antiquity in a curious way doesn't end with the Sasanians. At least to my mind, I think there's even more logical conclusion to think about 1000 or even push it to 1200. That is the late antiquity of what we think in the West, of this Roman Empire that was mentioned, doesn't really jive with the late antique idea of this sort of Euphrates to Tigris. This block has a different, I think, mindset, or in terms of studying its transformation, if you want to say.
So to go back, so what you're saying is that you think that the Parthians, and earlier you have Iranian dynasty, and Iranians themselves may see themselves, but they're not having this cultural influence the way that had.
I'm not saying they're not having cultural influence. I think that Sasanians, in part, what they're creating as a sort of a cultural idea, which embodies in their Khodainam, the book of Kings, or the Lords in the 6th century, that gets then promoted in the Shahnameh and throughout the region. These specific ideas that we know are associated with Sasanians, they may have, of course, been influenced by. It is from there that we're getting. It sets up ideas that I taught in the last talk, which included territory, citizenship, character, culture, history. As I explained in my last time, all of these elements are brought together in a specific way that we can still see its vestiges, or actually its remains. For example, with the Buyids, or the Babandids, or the Ghaznavids, or the Afridids. This is beyond Islamic, called pre-Islamic or post-Islamic descent. It's still viable, and it can be used and could be understood as in this region.
Okay, so I have no problem with the post-Islamic, that part is not a problem for me. It's more the front end,
The earlier part, which
that's my question, that's really my question,
the big issue is how much change was there made from the Parthian to the Sasanian. I think Professor Touraj's book, in terms of ideological matters, I think is trying to answer some of these issues.
Touraj, I know you know that the Armenian sources do not neglect Sasanians at all, although they get a negative press. But my question is, off your broader subject and going back to dynastic history and dynastic archives, one of the Armenian arguments is there are a lot of gaps, they say, because it is asserted that so many of the archives were destroyed by the Arabs. Can you talk to that issue of the royal archives and records, Sasanian records, having suffered enormous loss during the conquest?
My perspective may not be accepted by everyone, but I personally certainly do have a strong, I think, idea about what has happened to the remains of the Sasanian written tradition. Certainly, I think there was a written tradition from the 6th century. There's no doubt about this. Administratively, we have evidence, as well as I think the idea of history and whatnot. What happens is, we do in the Dinkard, in one of these Pahlavi texts, we in fact have a reference that the royal archives, when the Arabs came, caught fire.
What?
It caught fire and was destroyed. Now, this in the 70s was a bigger ideological battle in Iran, where Mutahari, for example, when these people had to defend Islam vis-a-vis these, very nationalist historians saying that the Arabs came and destroyed the Alexandria Library, and they destroyed the Sasanian, library as well. Which library? That was a matter of ideological, which I'm not interested in. But rather, we do have evidence that, of course, with conquest comes destruction, but not everything is destroyed.
Yeah, of course.
I think what we find a lot of in terms of Sasanian vestiges, of course, reappears in the Abbasid period. This translation movement in Beit al-Ahmad. What is of importance in terms of how Sasanians behaved, the kings, in terms of wisdom literature, in terms of book of governance and so on, they're all translated into Arabic and remains. I think the things that are not of use, like administrative matters, in the new Abbasid dynasty, when the language has made a switch, for example, from Arabic, from Pahlavi to Arabic, is of no use to be kept or to survive. And so I think, time takes its toll on this. And when you have, Zoroastrian as one of the dominant groups, I don't want to say the only dominant group, become a subaltern group, what is important for them in terms of keeping Zoroastrian literature, actually Pahlavi literature, is Zoroastrian's legal, material, not really wisdom texts or texts on, the court and so on. So you have the falling off of some of these important ideas, but then you can retrace these in Arabic literature. So those who do, in Arabic, study Arabic, Armenian, I think, Garasoyan, you know better because you're much more closer to it. She's done so much to delve out of Armenian sources on, where we can see about the Sasanians and also the Sasanian-Armenian relationship. I think you can still pull a lot of this, but you have to recreate it and reconstruct it.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.